Hi, welcome to Courtyard Conversations with UTA School of Social Work. I'm Coral Simpkins-Mims, Special Events Coordinator. Joining us today is Dr. Catherine LaBrenz, Assistant Professor here in the School of Social Work. She specializes in child welfare, reunification, permanence, and family engagement. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. LaBrenz. So welcome to our newest episode of Courtyard Conversations with UTA School of Social Work. Today we're going to be talking about the recent Supreme Court decision on the Fulton v. the City of Philadelphia case. So let me give you a little background. This case began in 2018 when the City of Philadelphia found that two social work service agencies providing foster care services were discriminating against same-sex couples. After the agencies were informed that they needed to comply with anti-discrimination policies, the agency decided to sue the city. On June 17th, in the Fulton v. the City of Philadelphia, the Supreme Court reversed the Third U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals ruling. The Supreme Court held that the City of Philadelphia violated the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment by having a provision in the government contract that required the agency not to discriminate against certifying same-sex couples as foster parents. So joining us today is Dr. Catherine LaBrenz, Assistant Professor here at the School of Social Work, and she specializes in child welfare, reunification, permanence, and family engagement. So thank you for joining us, Dr. LaBrenz. We're happy to have you.
Thank you for the introduction, Coral, and it's great to be here.
No problem. So could you tell us how you became personally involved in advocating on behalf of LGBTQ plus youth in foster care?
Sure. So I worked for several years as a child welfare practitioner, actually in Santiago, Chile, which is where I lived before moving to Texas in 2015. And so one of the things that drew me to social work, and the reason I decided to pursue an MSW and eventually a PhD, was the idea to really be committed to supporting children and families and recognizing that children fare best when they're in loving, supporting, affirming homes as well. And so during my PhD studies in Texas and then my time here at UTA, I've had a lot of opportunities to engage in research and support agencies in our area that are working with children in the foster care system. I'm really passionate about supporting children. If we think about the reason and the purpose of the child welfare system, it really is to support children from hard places, or children who've experienced trauma, who've experienced maltreatment, and experienced the forced separation in most cases from their families of origin. One thing that really caught my attention was a recent study that came out a year ago that the Annie Casey Foundation had conducted that found that almost 1 in 3 youth in foster care identify as LGBTQ+. So we know when we talk about disparities in the child welfare system, we know that there's racial disparities, and there also are disparities based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And so when we think about how we as a society want to support children that are in foster care, we have to acknowledge that there already is a much higher proportion of children and youth who identify as LGBTQ plus in child welfare than in the general population. And so with the Fulton versus City of Philadelphia, as well as several other ongoing lawsuits in several states that allow agencies to discriminate, we're really not focusing or bringing into this conversation the children and the youth's voices. And those are the voices that we're supposed to be ensuring well-being and safety and permanency for.
Absolutely. So speaking of that study, like you said, there are 1 in 3 youth who identify as LGBTQ plus youth. How are their needs different from cisgender or heterosexual youth?
So, when we think about why children enter the foster care system, and my background is all in child welfare and the impact of child maltreatment on child well being, we know that there's already trauma. There's going to be some trauma from separation from one's family of origin. Often there's going to be exposure to child maltreatment. In the case of LGBTQ plus youth who enter foster care or are in the system, sometimes there may also be an added layer of parental rejection. And so you may have some children or youth who enter foster care because their families of origin are not accepting or affirming of their sexual orientation or gender identity. So they've already experienced that rejection once. We know in general, not child specific, child welfare specific literature, that affirming homes and supportive families are two factors that buffer against a lot of the negative impacts and disparities that we see in mental health outcomes and a lot of other outcomes for the LGBTQ plus community. And so when we think about some of the adversities and the trauma already present in children who are not able to live with their families of origin, where there's already been this disruption in their attachment, there's been a disruption in the connections that they have to their birth culture, their birth family, the schools, their friends. It's that much more important to make sure that the houses that they're going to and the adults that are going to be taking care of them are providing that supportive, loving environment.
Absolutely. So, how can foster agencies truly support LGBTQ plus youth if they openly discriminate against LGBTQ plus families?
That is an excellent question. And that is actually one of the questions that we pose in an op ed that we are working on currently that has been absent in a lot of the discussions about the more legalities of these cases. And so Fulton versus the city of Philadelphia is just one example. There's actually an example here in Texas of the Diocese of Galveston that recently also started a lawsuit against the state of Texas because they do not want to license same-sex foster parents. And again, a lot of these cases, and I understand it's in the judicial world, often focus on the legality and what is past precedent and what does the anti-discrimination legislation say. But again, when we think about child welfare and the purpose of the child welfare system, which really is for child protection and well-being, we need to make sure that we are really embodying and embracing the purpose of the child welfare system. And so if we want our child welfare system to ensure child safety, to promote and enhance child well-being, we need to make sure that everyone that's involved in the life of the child is going to be affirming and validating of that child's identity. And so when we're discussing the legality of whether an agency can legally or should legally be able to say, we don't support that from our religious point of view, what does that say for the 1 in 3 youth that they're serving, that they're supposedly committed to and committed to ensuring that those youth have enhanced and improved well-being? What does that say to them when they say that they won't license foster families that look like them or who share that identity?
Right. Because it kind of seems as though in that circumstance, the beliefs of the organization is being put ahead of the needs of those youth and those children. So,
Yes, and I think that that's really what it comes down to is really asking these more reflective questions of child placing agencies of why are they getting involved? Why do they feel called to serve children in the foster care system? What is the purpose of that? And it should be to support that child, in which case we need to make sure that their policies with their own staff, with their own leadership, and certainly with the families that they're licensing, that they reflect that.
absolutely. So, how can current social workers advocate against these discriminatory practices?
That's a really great question. And here, at least in Texas, when we have legislative sessions, there's always opportunities for public commentary. We also, in social work, have our social work day at the legislature and advocacy day each year. And so students and practicing social workers, faculty, staff, they're able to come up with topics that they would like to be discussed at the social work at the legislature day. And this is one that's really important, especially here in Texas with what we've seen in our own profession. And so we've seen there's been a lot of debate in politics about whether our code of ethics, whether social workers and licensed social workers should be able to discriminate against clients and say they will not serve clients based on their religious beliefs because of the client's sexual orientation and gender identity. And we know that our code of ethics is very clear about striving for social justice and equity and starting and meeting the client where they are. And so it's tricky then when you are working with certain constraints and policies that don't allow us to fully realize our professional mission and our professional code.
Absolutely. So I know we just talked about how we can advocate. How can we also better support these youth and families that are going through the difficulty of supporting each other through foster care?
So I think one thing that we can do to support youth is continue with this larger macro advocacy piece. We need to make sure again that the agencies, that the policies are affirming and that they're supporting children in care. In addition, I would call on social workers broadly in our community to make sure that when you are getting involved or working at agencies that do have that are guided by certain religious beliefs, to make sure that you're still adhering to your code of ethics. And so just because you have your own personal religious beliefs, everyone of course is entitled to that. We know that religion can be a protective factor in some cases. It can help with coping. There's a lot of really positive benefits for some people for having that religious affiliation. At the same time, your own personal beliefs, religious beliefs, whether it's about sexual orientation, whether it's about something completely unrelated, those should not impede your professional duties and your professional skills and your professional responsibility to serve and support, in this case, youth and their families.
Absolutely. So it kind of sounds like finding a healthy balance between still honoring your beliefs, but also still advocating and supporting the youth that identify as LGBTQ plus.
Yes. Yes. And within the helping professions, what really sets social work apart is social work's focus on social justice and equity. And that's something that's in our code of ethics. At the national level, internationally, there's a focus on anti oppressive practices. And that's really what sets social work apart from some of the other helping professions like psychology or counseling that really just look at this micro setting. Here we consider the person within their environment. And so we have to recognize structures that are in place that lead to disparate outcomes for certain groups.
Absolutely. So, what advice do you have for current students who will be supporting these families in the future?
I would say to continue to advocate. I know the majority of our students here at UTA go into one of the direct practice specialties. I myself, when I was doing my master's program, did the more micro specialty as well. Um, but again, because this quest for social justice and this recognition of larger structural factors is something that sets social work apart, even and especially in some cases, if you're going into micro practice, it's important to make sure that our students are considering how are these policies impacting clients. If you're doing micro level work, if you end up being a clinician, you pursue your LCSW, how are these larger factors impacting the psychological well-being of the clients we're working with? Because we know that these larger changes in policies can impact our individual feelings and emotions and well-being.
Absolutely. So, some often see such court cases and decisions as anti-faith-based, but it sounds like you're advocating for the needs of the child over the needs of the institutions. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, I think that is a fair assessment. And I will say, I know a lot of people feel called to social work because of their religious beliefs. And if we look at a lot of the core values of social work, a lot of them align with core values of the three main religions, at least here in the US, if you think about Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, of helping your neighbor, serving the poor, serving those that are more vulnerable. And so, I know here at UTA, I sometimes will get students who ask, well, how do I navigate or balance my religious identity or my religious beliefs with social work, almost as if they're mutually exclusive. And they're certainly not. I think a lot of people, again, they feel called to social work, especially when you think about children and families and serving those that are vulnerable and in need of protection. That does not need to be mutually exclusive. What we do need to make sure is that, again, we're validating our clients' beliefs and we are starting where they are and we're affirming their identity. Because in cases of, for example, youth that are LGBTQ plus, that's their identity, that's who they are. And so we need to make sure that we're affirming that and that we're able to mesh and actually use our faith as a strength to say, you know what, from the perspective, whatever faith you are, whatever religion you practice, you want to serve those that need help and assistance. And so we're going to use those components to be able to best serve and best meet the needs of youth and care. And on that note, actually, one one thing to connect this, specifically thinking that this particular case, Fulton versus the city of Philadelphia, was with Catholic Social Services, is that Pope Francis actually recently also affirmed his support of the LGBTQ community. And so, although the Catholic Church traditionally may have a stance or doctrine that does not support same-sex marriages, he actually made a statement recently, and I'll quote him, saying that members of the LGBTQ plus community have a right to be in a family. They're children of God. They have a right to a family, and nobody should be thrown out of the family or made miserable over this. And so, going off of the Pope's direct quote about that, then we don't want to have youth or potential foster parents essentially thrown away or discarded by agencies because these specific practitioners don't agree with the lifestyle.
I totally agree. So, social workers want to be cautious that they don't further traumatize vulnerable children. What are some of the possible dangers of not affirming LGBTQ plus youth?
Yeah, and I think that that really is a great point to build upon the previous, the importance from more of a philosophical perspective from our discipline and the focus on social justice. But as social workers, we also are expected to engage in evidence based practices and research informed practice. So we can look at the research and we know what the outcomes are when youth do not have affirming homes or affirming relationships. We know that there's increased risk of negative mental health outcomes. We know that things like suicidality are a lot higher. And so when we think about how we need to approach this, we know there's evidence supporting the importance of affirming LGBTQ plus identities. We also know, for example, with conversion therapy, the detrimental impact that has, extremely detrimental impact on children and youth in the LGBTQ plus community. And so when we're thinking about supporting youth, especially again, those who are in child welfare, who've already experienced separation from family of origin, who've already often been exposed to some form of child maltreatment and or rejection, it's particularly important to make sure that we're trying to be as protective as possible. And we're trying to offer as many resources and supports as possible to mitigate the impact of exposure to those adverse childhood experiences early on.
Yes, absolutely. So, are there any other thoughts or comments that you have in regards to this case that you'd like to share with us?
I think most of them were covered. Again, going back to my expertise, which is trying to decrease child maltreatment, I would also argue that by supporting and affirming youth, we're reducing what I would call state sanctioned violence. And so in the US, the definition of child maltreatment is very focused um, on any actions or omissions if it's neglect by a parent or caregiver. But international definitions, including the World Health Organization, have it broader. So it can be another caregiver, it can be an institution or an agency that's contributing to child maltreatment. And I would argue that in these cases, we know the literature on the negative impact on mental health that discrimination in this case can have, and non-affirmation of one's identity. And I would argue that that impact is just as detrimental as child maltreatment and should in fact be considered child maltreatment when we're talking about open and blatant discrimination based on a child's identity, based on who they are. That's something that in this case, with these type of cases, it's a very slippery slope. And I feel like it's one where as states or the Supreme Court or the federal government begin to chip away at this, they're essentially endorsing state sanctioned child maltreatment, in which they are saying that youth identity, youth who are being served by agencies, that agencies do not have to affirm them, that they do not have to support them, and essentially that they're allowed to emotionally abuse the children based on their own identities. And so that's something that I think going forward is important and necessary to consider in these cases, and to consider youth voices. I mean, how can agencies say that they're serving youth and that they're there to support and protect youth when they openly and blatantly discriminate against the LGBTQ plus community, and they know that 1 in 3 youth in care identifies as such? So what message is that sending to the children, and what is that doing in terms of their emotional well-being?
Absolutely. And I think it's even amplified, like you said, when there are so many children that are affected by this, and there are so many children who need a home. So the biggest priority should just be providing that love and that support and that home for those children. So absolutely, this was a great conversation today. I'm glad we were able to talk about this topic, and I'm hopeful that we'll continue to advocate and push for the voices of the LGBTQ plus youth who are in foster care to be heard. So thank you for joining us today, Dr. LaBrenz.
All right, thank you so much for the opportunity again.
No problem. So to see more Courtyard conversations, be sure to subscribe, like, and share. Also turn on those post notifications. Be kind, stay safe, and remember we're all in this together. We'll see you next time.